Hello, I'm David DeCosmo, and this is People, Places, and Things. We've been traveling throughout our area to introduce you to the individuals, the institutions, and the attractions that make our area unique. Today, an attraction that once was, Luna Park. As our guide, my colleague Rusty Fender, who's done a lot of research into what was a major amusement park in this area. Rusty, there's, I guess, not much to see now.
This is the holy grail of those interested in anything having to do with amusement parks or entertainment of the turn of the last century, 2 centuries ago. And I'll tell you, this is a wonderful trip. It's a tough trek, but it's about time we got this show on the road.
Let's go take a look.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, there's very little physical evidence of the park that once existed here, but there is some. And Rusty, you tell me that the wall in front of us right here is actually part of the remnants of the park, in a sense.
You know, it's a good thing, David, that I'm a geologist as well, because you have to know everything about petrology and mineralogy and topography to get back in these places. But yes, this was a retaining wall put in back then, and they had dynamite back in 1905 and 1906. You can see that the injection marks for the dynamite were put in here. They drilled by, that's correct, they drilled by hand. They used the facade of this wall to hold back the embankment, which encroached on what they called the scenic railroad. The scenic railroad was kind of like a cardioidal pattern. It ran a figure 8 around the park itself. And of course, that was the big draw at the time. You know, there were only merry-go-rounds. The Ferris wheel, I don't think, was quite invented yet, because that was done in Paris in like 1912. We're talking about 1905, 1906 here. So the big draws here at this park were the scenic railroad, which took you on a nice trip around the park, and also the shoot-the-chutes, which at the time was like the largest structure, I believe, in 2 states.
Well, for people that never even heard of Luna Park, they probably know of NAOG. And at one time, NAOG, which still exists, was connected with Luna Park, and this retaining wall is part of that story too, because on top of this embankment, there's one other structure, and it has to do with linking the 2 parks. Let's go and take a look at that.
Sounds great. Great question too, as a matter of fact.
Okay. Rusty, how does this support connect what was Luna Park with NAOG Park?
And let me just say, great questions too. This entire excursion we're on just does not happen. I've been back here exhaustive times looking for these remnants, trying to piece things together. So this is just not a fly by the seat of your pants type of thing. This is very complicated to explain to folks. This is one side of what was called a 2-post embankment and embutment. There was one here and one here. This pillar, which is hand-laid, there was no cement back in those days. This had an 8-foot encroachment on top made of either steel, planks, or some type of wood, which was, again, they didn't plan on things to build for a long time, to last for a long time back then. There's no such thing as pressure-treated wood or anything back then. So what they did was they built this 8 feet off the ground, just enough for the 6-foot scenic railroad to go under it. So when you came off of this, which was built 8 feet, 8+ feet from here up, you would actually go over the scenic railroad as it came on this level, this grade, this crossing grade underneath the platform, which kind of gave a little more ambience and a little more excitement to the feel of the park. You know, you would come over from a stagnant footbridge, which was supposedly filled with 40,000 incandescent bulbs. We all know the way they exaggerated back in those days. I did an interview many times with Bobby Boris Pickett, the late great, who did the Monster Mash.
Right.
And he always laughed about, because he said, and I always parallel this, he always laughed because he said, you know, I laugh when people say that the Monster Mash sold 900 million copies. He said there weren't 900 million copies, there weren't 900 million people in the world back in 1962. And that's a great line. There was no way there were 40,000 incandescent bulbs. There weren't 40,000 incandescent bulbs in the United States in 1905. So it was paralleled, that comment, to here, because you would go over, and after coming across the bridge, you would feel the excitement. You could almost smell the cotton candy, the caramel apples. You could feel the excitement because the train ran every 7 minutes. So it was exciting to see all the park in action.
Well, if you were leaving Luna Park,
correct,
and you were going to NAOG,
correct,
you would come to the bridge that this supported.
That's correct.
And you would then cross
the walkway over these tracks, which are the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, later the Lackawanna, now Steamtown, the Laurel Line, which sat about 250 feet east of here, And then the Erie's Wyoming branch, the Erie Railroad, which was the predecessor of the Gravity Railroad. It hauled coal from the Knox Mine in Jenkins Township, Port Griffith, Pittston, all the way to Lackawaxen, where the coal was transported onto the Delaware and Lackawanna Canal barges, which went down to Delaware and then eventually to the Hudson. So you would come either way, and a 100-foot bridge crossed this with a canopy about now. It crossed not only Roaring Brook Creek, but the tracks here, and again about 50 feet of just woods on the other side. Not an easy thing to build, but there were supports which have been taken down. This is one of the 2 supports that still remain after 99 years.
Now, the footbridge came from Naog Park into Luna Park. Was that the only way into Luna Park?
There were 2 ways. The other way was by the Lackawanna and Wyoming Valley Railroad, best known as the Laurel Line, which went from Wilkes-Barre to the Cedar Avenue terminal in Scranton. That was from the east side of the park. The subway is still there, the subway being a small culvert. It's not a drainage culvert, but a culvert to walk under the one track of the Dunmore line.
Why did they have to go under the tracks?
You know why? Because of the third rail. The electrified third rail, which was 440 volts at that time. No one could cross the Laurel Line tracks anywhere. They had most of it fenced in except way out in the wilderness. But again, they built that at a cost of about $30,000, the subway. It never paid itself off. This park was a money loser from day one. Arthur Frothingham, who was the founder of Rocky Glen Park, and a man named Frederick Ingersoll, no way, shape, or form connected with Ingersoll Rand, the people who make the construction compressors, but Ingersoll, he had 4 different parks of Luna Parks. It was one of the first franchises of entertainment probably in the world.
Well, there was a Luna Park at Coney Island.
That's correct. Coney Island, New York, Hartford, Connecticut. They had one in Pittsburgh, and they had the big one in Cleveland. This was the 5th in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Never broke even, never made money, and was never insured.
The park itself would now have spanned the distance behind us.
Correct.
At this point, that's literally cut in half by the interstate.
That's correct. If you're on the Interstate 81 on the northbound side, where the subway to walk under the one track. Remember, the Laurel Line was 2-track all the way from Wilkes-Barre, and it followed the course of the Central Scranton Expressway. Right under the Central Scranton Expressway is where the 2 tracks went down to Cedar Avenue. There was a Dunmore branch, a short-lived Dunmore branch, which was deactivated back in the 1940s. I believe 1947 and 1948. Again, it had about a 40-year span. It was a single track which went to Myrtle Street. Myrtle Street is a street up here which houses still are on. Many have been razed because of the construction of Interstate 81 between 1959 and 1964. The interstate, of course, was opened fully in 68. But in 64, they demolished a lot of the houses along Myrtle Street in Dunmore, which the backyards of those houses was literally the front yard of Luna Park.
Was Luna Park built in this area primarily because of the railroad access?
Correct. The Delaware, Lackawanna Western, the Erie, which had passenger service, but there was no stop. But just like Rocky Glen Park was built for the Laurel Line instead of vice versa, this was built for the Laurel Line as well. The Laurel Line served this park. Most people actually came from the Naog Park side. So again, even the Laurel Line, which eventually went out of business on New Year's Eve, 1953, that was a money loser as well, because the Laurel Line had to skirt all the population areas. The Erie, the Delaware, Lackawanna and Western, the Delaware and Hudson, the Central of New Jersey, they already had their, and the Ontario and Western, they already had their ties in the Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area. So the Laurel Line was kind of like the bad child. It had to take the right-of-way, which wasn't already pioneered by the big guys. So that was always the bad child of the family, was the Laurel Line, and they got tied up with other bad children who never made money, like Luna Park.
Let's walk in a little bit further to where the park actually existed.
Absolutely.
Here's another piece of rock structure that was built. Is this the other half of the support for the bridge?
Exactly. As Mark McGlory just panned across, you can get the depth of field and the width of this span. It's 100 feet across and probably about, I'd say, 18 to 20 feet across.
It would have been wide enough for a car to go across.
Oh, absolutely, if there were at that time. You can see a lot of the top fieldstone has been chipped away from here, so this has more of a slant. Believe me, this was perfectly plumb and level back in 1906 when the park opened on May 28th. It was set back 1 week from May 21st. Due to a couple of factors, they said equipment for the park, electrical equipment had not yet arrived, and horrendous spring weather. Of course, May 28th, inherently, that is Memorial Day weekend. There was no Memorial Day back in 1906 because World War II was still 30 years away from there. But it was that weekend, kind of the unofficial start to summer. You can see this was built with planks, and the abutment here still exists from the elevation from the tracks. So this was kind of a breathtaking walk even over here when you think about it. I mean, you were about 25 feet off the ground. It was exciting getting here, and it was more exciting being here.
Ticket booths on both sides of this walkway.
5-cent admission. Both sides of the walkway, the heavier of the two on the Nayog Park side.
So if you were visiting Luna Park in 1906, what sort of attractions were here to lure the people to the park?
Quite a few. They had their groundwork laid, of course. The main attraction even back then was the carousel. And the carousel was said to have cost over $30,000. That would be a little over $3 million in today's
dollars,
terms. Exactly
sure.
right, $30,000. Again, like I said about the Bobby Boris Pickett Monster Mash thing, everything was inflated back then. There's no way to prove that. People didn't keep records. This was kind of a bad child Lackawanna County park at the time. No one wanted to claim, you know, existence or ownership to something that was a money loser at the time. Edisonia, taken from Thomas Edison, of course, as we well know it, one of the many inventors of the electric incandescent light bulb. Edisonia and the Temple of Mystery, her huge, which we have photos of, thanks to the Lackawanna Historical Society, by the way, located at the Catlin House next to the University of Scranton. We thank them. It was located next to the area of the carousel, which is where 81 is. You can probably hear the traffic right now. Edisonia for Thomas Edison. It had all the inventions of Thomas Edison up to that time. Edisonia. Also, the Temple of Mystery had, kind of like a Ripley's Believe It or Not of 1906, it had, I mean, this is not a good word to use, but the freaks of the day, which were sideshow performers. And in the dance hall, which was one of the biggest around, it had ethnic acts. And at the time, again, the term of Negro music, of colored music. They had the Blarney Castle for the Irish. Everything was ethnic, as you well know, back at the turn of the last century, and 2 centuries ago. And a lot of the different rides were really based on water, because water was plentiful around this area. As you can see, a lot of runoff still exists here. Exactly. So what they did was they had this great ride called the Scenic River. And the Scenic River is kind of like the predecessor of today's Pirates of the Caribbean attraction, one of the top attractions at Universal Studios.
You go through sort of a tunnel type thing in a boat.
You're in a boat, a very shallow wading pool. You're kind of boxed in on the side, so you can't navigate yourself. And you see all these different areas of scenery, and the scenery changes. Back then, they had steam-powered turbines to actually move the scenery while you were going through. So it not only gave the appearance that you were moving, but moving faster. Don't forget, if you're moving in a boat and the scenery is turning, it looks like you're doing a motorboat ride down the river. So, you know, a lot of innovation but again, it was one of the first electrical parks in the country, electrical parks. And unfortunately, because of that, they had a lot of problems, which was why the delay from May 21st to May 28th. But it was just something to see. Don't forget, that was the era of candles and gas lights up until the 1920s. So to have something like this powered by electricity in Scranton, the electric city, was a big coup.
You also indicated that there was a major water attraction here. Can we have a look at remnants there?
You bet. And this is very interesting to see. This was the tallest structure, and again, today you would kind of equate this to one of the water slides at, say, a Camel Beach or something like that. So called the shoot-the-chutes. You would come down on a fiber rug, a fiber mat. You would climb up this 50-foot platform, slide down this water slide, and again, at the time there was no water. Now we know the water slides, they pump water up to it, so you're coming down in a stream of water. Back then you came down dry on just a wet mat. So it did not have the speed, the velocity, or I'm sure the excitement of today's rides, because everything now is high tech. But when you came down, you went into this lagoon, which is right now near mile marker 185.4. If you're on 81, that's where the other half of the lagoon would have stood, until, again, with the exception of the creation of Interstate 81 back in 1964. They cut through it, but they left a little bit about it. If you know where to look, you can still see the remnants of the shoot-the-chutes.
Do you know where to look?
I sure do.
Let's go look. Now we can even see some houses in the distance
That is
here.
Myrtle Street, correct. And a lot of these houses were raised, again, with the development of the interstate highway system by Dwight Eisenhower back in the 1950s. Now, this is a very, very historic area. This was actually the picnic grounds where we're standing right now. This was the picnic grounds. Now, just for the viewer, we're looking east, which is where I'm pointing, and where Mark is showing. East is 81, you can hear the traffic right there, and again, west is here. Everything is based on a north-south quadrant here, so the rides were built along this narrow swath of land where 81 stands right now. So most of the park is gone, but this was the main picnic area, the picnic grove, and you can see because this is probably the most level area of the park. You notice
still somewhat open.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you notice the way we came up on very rugged terrain. It's nice and smooth in this area here. So this is probably the only level area of this park. And this was where they enjoyed their afternoons with hot dogs and whatever they had.
And people would have come over and would have had a picnic here.
Absolutely.
And then probably had the kids enjoy the rides.
And you know, to get here was an all-day deal, David. I mean, you know, you had to come by Loreline. The automobile, there were few and far between in 1906. So to get here would probably be the equivalent of going to the Panama Canal in this day and age. I mean, this was not an easy trek to make. They had electricity, bugs all over the place. There were post roads, as you well know, when they lay the trees, felled trees in the road. That was the first Boston Post Road, which was now United States 1, US 1 through the Bronx, and they still have remnants. So they made post roads back then to try and get the wagons or the carriages or even the few Duryea automobiles that were manufactured back around that time along these post roads, which were eroded and flooded and just awful. It was just log roads.
But as wonderful as it seems, as modern as it was for the time, you say that it never really made any money.
It didn't. The Loreline, once again, at the time, was a problem because the Loreline had other commitments. The service on the one-track Dunmore branch offered terrible service. It was only one track to Myrtle Street. It would back up then because the Loreline had a car where you could drive, you could engineer from both sides and all that. It was just not a moneymaker. And again, with a seasonal park like this, you had to close during the winter. So this was only open until Labor Day.
So you could only use it during the summer months,
exactly
obviously.
Right. They couldn't afford insurance on it. And Ingersoll, Frederick Ingersoll, who we mentioned earlier, he had a lot of money-losing inventions. Coney Park, as you mentioned, made a lot of money. So did Cleveland. So did Hartford. The various things he had didn't. And he eventually, before this park even closed, he went bankrupt. So again, you wonder how someone that can own so much and do so many things can go bankrupt. Bad investments.
And isn't it sad when we look at it from the historical perspective to realize what was here, what was so new and revolutionary at the time, and yet now we have an overgrown area, very few remnants that fortunately you have sought out. And of course, the one we mentioned that we're heading to right now is the remnants of the lagoon that the shoot-the-chutes emptied into or onto.
Look at, I can even go better than that. Look at Rocky Glen now in total disrepair.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the Loreline's big stop in Jenkins Township was Valley View Park. Valley View Park off of, in the Inkerman area, off of Market Street, Valley View Park is now the Valley View Mobile Home Park. So as overgrown and wooded as this, you know, you look at these places and it still has its whimsical, folksy charm. It's a genial area, just full of great memories. And we don't remember the park, of course, like that. But parks like that were big because there was no air conditioning in the city. People used to escape all the areas to go to the Catskills for the cool mountain because there was no air conditioning till the mid-1920s. You know, the compressors have not been invented for air conditioning in big buildings and all that. So it's amazing, you're right to say that, but little parks along the way have a place in society. And we all know that the pendulum swings. The big deal when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, you had to go to Great Adventure. You had to pay at the time, $20, which was big money to get in. Who cares about the Angela Parks in Hazleton? Who cares about Hanson's Amusement Park? Who cares about Croups Glen over near Hunlock Creek? Who cares about Rocky Glen? the pendulum swings back, and now it's not cool. It's got the hip factor. Everything's got to have a hip factor. And now it's not cool to go to these big parks. I mean, it's the only place to go now. You take the family, it costs you a couple $1,000s to go to Universal, or Universal Studios, or Orlando, or SeaWorld, or whatever. But the park, as the pendulum swings back, now local parks are cool, and that's why they're trying to revitalize Rocky Glen. If it wasn't part of a New Jersey developer who still wants to turn that area into condos and co-op condos overlooking beautiful Rocky Glen Lake. But I believe it eventually swings back. It's going to take a long time to swing back, because you and I know that if you had a single screen movie theater, you wouldn't make it until the close of business today. You have to have a 20
And ironically, one of the biggest parks today, certainly in the state of Pennsylvania, is Knoebels, which is a free admission type park, and basically you pay for what you want to go on. You don't pay that admission, so that the grandparents that don't necessarily want to be on a roller coaster don't have to pay to get into the park. They can just sit and watch the kids as they enjoy it. I still don't see that lagoon. Are we close?
We're close. I'm going to find it. I think it's over here.
All right, finding the remnants of the shoot-the-chutes lagoon required a little bit of a trek.
I didn't say this was going to be easy.
You found it.
You should have done this when it was -4 in February. I was soaking wet with perspiration. I was this close to having walking pneumonia. But David, feast your eyes on what was the 6-foot concrete perimeter of the western side of the shoot-the-chutes lagoon. Mark, follow us.
The wall that we're seeing here was the
6
wall.
foot down, full of water. This is all the fill, what's called riprap, from the Interstate 81 construction. They filled most of it in with riprap. But this was actually, I mean, you can stand right on it now. This was 6 feet down and full of water on this hand-mixed, hand-poured concrete from 1906. The shoot-the-chutes was so big, it went out into the median, which now separates the north and southbound lanes of 81 at mile marker 1.
So this was gigantic.
This was gigantic. And in the 1940s, the Erie Railroad, the Laurel Line, and the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, the hobos, this was the largest hobo jungle, as they call them, at Myrtle Street in the entire region. The hobos used to bathe and wash their laundry in the rainwater, which collected in the shoot-the-chutes lagoon. So again, you came down from this 50-foot slide into the water. That's where the slide was, where Mark is showing us right now, headed looking south on 81. You came down into this on a mat. They took the mat, there was a collector who took the mats, which you slid down on in the water, and then you could swim or just hang out in the water. It was only 6 feet. So chances are, even I probably couldn't drown, and I can't swim in this water. But this was the entire massive west end of the shoot-the-chutes, later used as a washing basin for the hobos.
So even after the park was gone, this was used by somebody.
Unfortunately, it wasn't used in a very good memory, but this was used, and you can see, we can follow it this way. And it stops right at the 25-foot safety fence, which is 25 feet off the shoulder of 81. That's the rules of the construction. So it stops right at the fence, and the rest is all torn out. This is actual hand-poured, hand-mixed concrete construction from 1906. I see sidewalks in my area that were put in a year ago that don't look this good.
And
1906
so well preserved.
Incredible,
Absolutely,
isn't it?
absolutely.
And mainly, David, because of the remote location. That's why remnants still exist here.
So few, though, when you consider what that park had to offer. You said it had those attractions. You said it never made money. How long did it last?
It opened May 28th, officially, 1906. And at 3:03 in the morning of August 23rd, 1916, 10 years later, they figure an errant spark, because it was all steam engines back then, an errant spark from the smokestack of the Erie Railroad dropped glowing embers and cinders on the dance pavilion. Because they weren't using a spark arrestor or spark collector, they figured, the sparks were being shot into the air in this remote location.
From the railroad engine.
From the railroad engine, correct. It burned the dance pavilion at Asonia, the Temple of Mystery, the Blarney Castle. The whole park was consumed 3:03 in the morning, August 23rd, 1916. So it had a life of just 10 years. The park was not insured. They were actually going to rebuild it because of the bankruptcy problem with Frederick Ingersoll. The park was never rebuilt, and the Lackawanna County folks didn't want anything to do with it. They wanted to center their efforts on NAOG, which still exists, as you mentioned before.
What a memory, what it was, and I guess if you think in one respect what it could have been.
And you know, David, the thing is, when you look at this now, the three of us know about this, but who would know? This little retaining wall was part of 100 years of amusement park history. Who would ever think this if you didn't already know?
Did any of the attractions at all survive to be sent elsewhere?
Nothing survived at that time. The main attractions, again, were not really attractions as we know it. I'm not quite sure. I think that some of the carousel horses survived, but they were really charred and burned. They did not have the restoration procedures we do have today, where we can restore the Sistine Chapel to its brilliance and all that. But for the most part, they're not rides as we know them today. There was a small roller coaster. Again, the rides today are just so high-tech. It costs $80 million to build one ride of some of these high-tech roller coasters. So nothing was really worth salvaging at the time, and most of the park, being all of wood construction, burned to the ground back on August 23rd.
So even if the land were yet available, it would be totally impractical to try to recreate what was here.
Yeah, we got to wait till that pendulum swings back just a little more with the small amusement park versus the gigantic monoliths, which we know is Universal and Disneyland and Disney World. It's going to be a long time coming. I do think there's a place in society for a local amusement park, or let me put that a different way, a regional amusement park, not a local one. Just like there is a place in society for a Dietrich Theater and a local Tunkhannock Theater which shows actual film and does events. You'll never compete with the Cinemarks, and I don't think that you want to.
No.
But eventually I think that the regional amusement park will return to society. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be around to patronize the Edsonia or the Temple of Mystery, David.
Well, perhaps some things are best preserved as memories, and this may be a classic example. And I thank you for taking us on this unusual tour to an attraction that once existed and is, in fact, now just a memory. I'm David DeCosmo for People, Places, and Things. Thanks for joining us on ECTV.